Have you ever wondered why we behave the way we do? Why do our decisions sometimes seem completely automatic? Or why do we say one thing and act differently? We all tend to think that we understand human behavior well, but psychology reveals facts about our minds that sometimes go against our expectations and make us doubt many things that we thought were true about ourselves and others. Let's discuss some of them. How much of what you do, say, or think every day is a conscious choice, do you think? Most people will answer that almost everything. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings who consciously decide what to eat, how to act, and even what to feel. But that's not really the case. Many of our actions are controlled by forces of which we are either unaware or barely aware. Consider, for example, implicit bias. It's the idea that we subconsciously associate certain traits with people based on their race, gender, or background. And despite the fact that we consider ourselves open, these biases remain deep in our subconscious. A study titled, "Did Jamal Receive a Harsher Sentence Than James?" examined the impact of racial stereotypes in names on the sentences of black men. The researchers analyzed data from court decisions in Florida and found that black men with typical black names receive stricter sentences even under the same circumstances. And it's not just about bias. The subconscious mind can influence us in more subtle ways. For example, priming is a phenomenon in which external signals, however imperceptible, can change your behavior. In one study, scientists left a jar of money in the corner of a room and noticed that it made people become less generous and more selfish, even if they didn't realize how this visual stimulus affected them. Another example is an experiment in a supermarket where French music was played in the wine department. In the days when French music was playing, sales of French wine were growing, and when German music was playing, German wine was growing. These studies show how often our behavior is guided by unconscious forces, and we may not always realize it. This raises a big question. If our behavior is shaped by factors that we have no control over, how much is it really ours? Are we free in our decisions? William Blake's famous poem, The Unconquered, ends with the lines, "I am the master of my destiny. I am the captain of my soul." It's inspiring, but is it true? What if some of our decisions are made before we realize them? In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment to understand exactly when the brain makes decisions. He found out that the brain makes a decision 300 milliseconds before a person realizes it. This brings us to a serious question. If the brain makes a decision before we realize it, can we talk about free will? Liebet argued that although the brain can initiate actions unconsciously, we still have the ability to reverse the decision at the last moment. But new research has shown that the brain can predict our choices 7 seconds before we make them. This calls into question not only our free will, but also our understanding of morality and responsibility. No matter how much we want to believe that our actions are determined by our personality, psychology shows that the environment plays a much bigger role than we think. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo organized an experiment in the basement of Stanford University, creating an imitation prison. The participants were randomly divided into two groups, guards and prisoners. Within a few days, the guards began to show brutality, using psychological violence and physical intimidation, while the prisoners began to rebel, surrender, or completely obey their guards. They were ordinary students who could study at any college. So what made them behave like this? It was all about the environment, the roles, the form, and the feeling of power or helplessness created such an atmosphere that the participants began to act in a truly shocking way that surprised even themselves. The influence of the environment on our choices is not just an extreme example. Research shows that even small changes in our environment can significantly affect our behavior. For example, if healthier food is placed at eye level in a cafe, people are more likely to make healthy food choices without even realizing how this is related to their decision. Thus, our behavior may be much less conscious and independent than we would like to think. Psychology is a field in which there are still many unknowns, but one thing has become obvious. Sometimes when someone behaves unusually, it is not always related to who they really are, but to where they are. Let's now talk about one of the most unpleasant truths about human nature. We are really very good at lying to ourselves. I'm not talking about small things like promises that you'll go to the gym tomorrow. I mean the inner work that we do to justify our actions or beliefs that contradict how we perceive ourselves. This phenomenon is called cognitive dissonance, and it has become one of the most interesting discoveries in psychology. When your actions contradict your beliefs, it causes discomfort, and the brain begins to work to resolve this conflict. Most often, he does this by changing your beliefs to match your actions rather than the other way around. Let's take a classic experiment. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger asked participants to complete a very boring task, turning wooden pegs on a blackboard for an hour. After that, some were paid $1 to tell the next group that the task was interesting, while others were paid $20 for the same. When participants were asked if they really enjoyed the task, those who received $1 were much more likely to answer yes. This was because they had to justify lying for such a small reward. Their brains couldn't handle the dissonance. I lied for $1, and I don't want to be a liar, so they changed their minds about the assignment, deciding it might not have been that boring. This effect is not limited to boring tasks only. It is found everywhere. For example, when you spend effort making a bad decision because admitting a mistake seems even worse than continuing, or when you convince yourself that the purchase was worthwhile, even if you know deep down that it wasn't. Cognitive dissonance explains many aspects of behavior, including political polarization and brand loyalty. It also helps to understand why we persist in arguments, even if we are convinced that we are wrong. Admitting a mistake is difficult. We often think of memory as something ordered, like a mental filing cabinet in which all life experiences are stored, ready for use. But in fact, our memory is much more chaotic. It's like an artist who is constantly editing, erasing, and redrawing our memories without realizing it. One of the most famous discoveries in the field of memory belongs to psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. In one of her experiments, participants were shown a video of an accident and then asked questions about what they had seen. Some of them asked how fast the cars were moving when they collided, while others were asked a question with a slightly different word. Are the cars broken? This small change in the question strongly influenced the participants' memories. Those who heard the word broken thought that the cars were moving faster and often remembered that they had seen broken glass, although it was not on the video. In another study, Loftus showed how completely false memories can be implanted. Participants were told that they got lost in the mall as children, although in fact this never happened. With a slight hint, they began to confidently recall this event, sometimes adding vivid details to their stories. These studies show the importance of how our memory can be unreliable. For example, witness statements often turn out to be incorrect, as people can remember events that never happened due to the brain adding details that did not happen. Another interesting phenomenon is the witness effect. Research has shown that when someone finds themselves in an emergency situation in front of many people, almost no one will intervene, believing that someone else will help. This is due to the dispersion of responsibility and social proof. We look at others to figure out how to react. If no one intervenes, we think the situation is not that serious. This effect was widely known after the Kitty Genovese tragedy in New York, when no one intervened, despite the fact that dozens of neighbors heard her screams. This tragedy caused widespread outrage and raised a chilling question. Why didn't anyone do anything? Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Lathan decided to find out. They conducted experiments in which participants believed they were eavesdropping on someone in another room experiencing a medical emergency. When people thought they were the only ones who could help, most took action. But their willingness to act dropped dramatically, and when they believed, others listened too. The more outside observers there were, the less likely it was that someone would help. So why is this happening? It's not because people are indifferent or cruel. This is psychology. Firstly, it is a dispersion of responsibility. The assumption is that someone else will step in. Then comes the social proof. We look at others to assess how serious the situation is. If no one acts, we delay, thinking that this may not be an emergency. The witness effect is not just a historical or theoretical concept. It is played daily. Think of the videos on the internet where people walk past someone who is clearly in need, or the moments when crowds of people witness injustice but remain silent. It's embarrassing to admit it, but any of us can fall into this trap under certain circumstances. Human behavior is much more complex than we used to think. We often consider ourselves logical and independent, but in fact our actions are strongly influenced by emotions, instincts, and the social environment in which we find ourselves. These factors affect us much more than we realize. When we understand these psychological patterns, we can better understand why people act the way they do. But sometimes, this picture is different from what we imagine.